Amen. All right. The topic this week will be Sabbath day in the Old Testament. This will be part one. Okay. The last time we met, we dug a little bit into the biblical calendar and discovered it was based on the movements of the sun, moon, and the stars from Genesis 1, verse 14, and that certain holidays were celebrated in conjunction with various harvest times. You can find that from Leviticus 23. And after doing some more digging since that last study, it has become evident to me that Israel's calendar was also immensely practical. Okay, God designed it to be a healthy pattern for public worship and fellowship. Proper observance of it would have helped Israel balance out their lives. And in keeping it, they would have habitually learned to prioritize the kingdom of God over the things of this world. And it would help them become a spiritually minded nation rather than a people solely concerned with carnal, worldly things. Okay, so that the calendar was a very unique thing. Think about this. God doesn't tell somebody to do something or create a system of any sort if it's not very good. It doesn't work, okay? He only tells us the very best. And going back to wanting, public worship, Christians wanting public worship and rest and all that, most of us want the same thing. We want the same thing that God was offering to Israel. We want balance. We don't want to neglect the things that are important to God in favor of the cares of this life. Okay, at least if you're a real Christian, you don't want to do that, right? And we're constantly struggling to keep things in their proper order. And I guess the question as we begin this series is, how do we do that? How do we keep that right balance? Could keeping a literal seventh-day Sabbath be the lost key for many to find this balance? Okay, could keeping the Sabbath, a literal seventh-day Sabbath, be the key all along to finding this balance? Well, before we answer that question directly, I think it's important that we go through a process of understanding the Sabbath as much as we can. Okay, so number one, as we do this series of studies, I don't know how many studies this is going to be, 3, 4. We're going to go with the Lord's leading on this. But we're gonna do it methodically, okay? We're not gonna just jump to our own opinions and or let our own desires tell us what should be done and what shouldn't. So I'll go through the list here. What was the Sabbath? How was it observed in Old Testament times? And that's what we're going to attempt to study here today. And then as we move on, number 2, we want to figure out how was the Sabbath distorted. We're going to figure out how the Sabbath was distorted by the Pharisees in the New Testament times. Because obviously no one wants to repeat what the scribes or what the Pharisees did during Jesus' time. And number 3, was a literal Sabbath day. We want to discover if a literal Sabbath day was observed by most Christians during the last 2,000 years since Christ. And finally, number 4, at the end of this series, we want to ask ourselves this question or find the answer to this question. Does a literal Sabbath day still apply today? If so, how are we to observe it? How are we to observe it? Okay, so there are 2 schools of thought basically in our modern day amongst modern Christians. Is that one school of thought says, yes, it's the 4th commandment. It hasn't changed. There should be a day set aside for every, a day set aside for rest and worship after 6 days of work. And the other school of thought says Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath. Therefore, I rest in Jesus as a believer. I rest in Jesus every day. Therefore, a literal day no longer applies for me. Okay, so we want to get to the bottom of this because both sides aren't right. Okay, both sides aren't right. Just as There are very smart people who are Hindus, who are Buddhists, who are Muslims. Okay? And there are very smart intellectual people that are Christians. So we don't say, well, they're both equal, they're both good, because smart religious people on both sides of the coin come up with different conclusions. What I'm trying to say is there is a right answer to this. There's not there is the truth. And that's, as Damien pointed out in his prayer, asked in his prayer, that's what we're seeking. We're seeking the truth. Okay? We don't want to just take sides of this wise guy versus that wise guy. Okay? We need to search the scriptures for ourselves to discover if a matter is true or not. Joshua, can you pull that plug there? There we go. Thank you. I think I figured out there's a little slight adjustment I have to make for my slides if they freeze up. There was a radio frequency interruption going on with one of our devices of the setup here, but I think we're good from here on out. Here we go. So Proverbs 18 verse 13 says, he that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. Now, there are many people listening to this study right now that may already have their minds made up. Joshua, please remember to switch back and forth. I know he wants to gaze into that wonderful verse from the book of Proverbs. All right, so there are people that they just want to already have their mind made up on a topic, right? No, I'm not going to look at it. But Proverbs says, he that answereth a matter before he hears it, before he studies it out, listens to all of the different things that you need to listen to before you make a decision. It's folly and shame to that person. Okay. So we don't want to be rash. We don't want to just say, nope, I got three verses in my mind and I already know that's not the answer because of this, and that. Well, what about all these other verses? And what about history? And what about this and that? Have you considered that? Nope, because I got 2 verses in my mind. How do you know they're in context? I don't know. It's just what I believe. We don't want to do that, right? Because that's folly and shame. Here, I thought I had it fixed, and now I'm running into the same frozen issue. I tested this yesterday, and it worked. But now, all of a sudden, I wonder, no, it couldn't be. I wonder what's... Anyways, I'm just thinking to myself. All right, Genesis 2, verse 1. We're going to go back to the very beginning of when the Sabbath was first mentioned in the Bible. All right, way back at the beginning during creation. Let's check this out. Genesis 2, verse 1. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God, now check this out, this is important. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from the work which God created and made. Now think about this. God, right from the very beginning of creation, sanctified this day. He made it holy. This was a holy day from the very beginning. There are many people who will say, well, the Sabbath was only given to Israel because it was a sign of the covenant and so forth. But here we discover that on the 7th day of creation, it was already set apart and made holy by God. Well, that's just for God, some people would say. Okay? That's just for God. No, whatever God does, it means that's what it is. So when God created the heavens and the earth and he made light and everything, was that just for God? Does that only apply to God? We don't have light and darkness? All right? So now remember, today's object is only to discover the Old Testament roots of the Sabbath, okay? And that's what we're focusing on. But it's clear and evident that it starts at creation. Now, we're going to get into it later where Jesus says that, when he's dealing with the scribes and Pharisees, and the Pharisees made the Sabbath day a burden, they started making all these extra rules. And he said the Sabbath day was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay? Notice Jesus didn't say the Sabbath day was made for Israel, was instituted when Israel became a nation. No, he said it was made for man. What does that tell us? It goes all the way back to Adam, mankind. Okay? All right. Interestingly, when you go back to the book of Genesis, that's where the foundation of all truth is. There were only, we haven't even got to the Garden of Eden yet. So up to this point, man was only given a few simple commands. Does anybody remember what those are? Be fruitful and multiply. Subdue the earth and have dominion over the animals. That was man's only command at this time, at least in our recorded Bibles, right? But the next command, or the next thing we see, is the first and only holy day, and that was the seventh day, okay? Set apart by God. So you had the most and think about this, that really is any work we do on the earth right now is to do what? Be fruitful and multiply. You're trying to grow things, right? Be fruitful and multiply, not only your progeny, but even your family's, belongings and so forth. Be fruitful and multiply. And also we're always trying to, our work is to make order out of something that is not in order. That's what work is. You're constantly, let's say gardening, right? You plant a garden. You got to take the wild nature and you got to cultivate it so that you have dominion over it. You can grow with it, right? Or you can use the land to grow. Animals, you tame animals. You got farm animals. All this, everything we do is, all of our work falls under this basic command of be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, and have dominion over it. And the other most basic thing for man was rest on the seventh day, because God sanctified it and called it holy. All right, we're going to jump over to Exodus 16, chapter 16, verse 1. And in this chapter, we're going to see God give Israel a basic lesson in Sabbath observance. You could call it basic training. You could call it the ABCs of how to observe or how to obey the Sabbath day, because they were just taken out of Egypt. They were rescued by God. They were saved by the blood of the Lamb, and they went into the wilderness, and God was teaching them how to become his people. Exodus 16, verse 1, and we're going to be reading through most of this chapter today here. And they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. After their departing out of the land of Egypt. All right. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, would to God that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. All right, with hunger. This is very interesting, because the children of Israel are lacking faith here. And this is in connection with the Sabbath, okay? You're going to see how it's in connection with the Sabbath. They lacked faith that God would provide for them, that God would be there for them. And instead, they would rather go back into, instead of having freedom to be God's servants, they would rather go back and be slaves to the world in Egypt. Think about that. Bondage. Why was bondage more comfortable for them? Because they knew that even though they were slaves in Egypt and they were in all this idolatry, they knew they were going to get their daily meals. Okay, the Egyptians were going to feed them so they could get the work done for them. But how many people today are more comfortable being in bondage to this world than they are of making a leap of faith to declare to the world that they are servants of God and they will trust in his provision? Okay? Think about that. Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather at a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, check this out, that I may prove them, I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or no. That's why I said this is going to be basic training and obedience to God's law. And notice part of the number one thing he's going to do, the number one test of obedience to his law is going to be whether or not they're going to keep the Sabbath day. Now I've been studying, I'm getting ahead of myself because I've taken the study a lot further than where we are today already, so I can kind of see where things are going. In early American history, they discovered there were some surveys done, and they discovered that though they used to have laws in place for Sabbath observance, and you couldn't violate those, and if you did, some of the states had punishments by fines and so forth. But they discovered that the criminals, the people that were in prison for felonies or have committed some crimes, they were the same people who constantly were caught profaning the Sabbath day. Okay? So what you see here is it almost goes hand in hand. And now, Pastor Ben, how does that make sense? Well, think about this. Back in that day, if you're working really hard, the seventh day, you don't have internet, you don't have all this stuff today. But the only time you're going to have somebody teaching you the Bible or you learning the Bible is on the Sabbath day. And now if you're profaning it and not going to hear the instruction of the Lord and fellowshipping with other Christians, your moral compass is going to be in the toilet, right? Therefore, the other 6 days, you have no knowledge to guard yourself against all this, and you're going to be an immoral person. Okay? Be an immoral person and commit crimes because you are an ignorant person. You are unlearned. And you haven't practiced any sort of obedience or honor to God. All right, verse 4, Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And I think I already read that. So God wants to prove them to see whether they'll follow his law or no. Okay, verse 6, And Moses and Aaron said unto all the children of Israel, At even then shall you know that the Lord hath brought you out from the land of Egypt. And in the morning then you shall see the glory of the Lord, for that he heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that you murmur against us? And Moses said, This shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, for that the Lord heareth your murmurings when you murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. And Moses spake unto Aaron, Say unto the congregation of the children of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he hath heard your murmurings. And it came to pass, as Aaron spake unto the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, At even shall you eat flesh, and in the morning shall you be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So what are their murmurings? Hey, it was better in the world. It was better in Egypt than to follow God. I follow God, bad things happen. I don't even know what we're going to eat tomorrow. I don't know all this. So they'd rather be in bondage. They'd rather be a slave to Satan because it was more comfortable, right? And it came to pass that at even the quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning the dew laid round about the host. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness, there lay a small round thing, as small as hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, It is manna. Manna means, what is that? For they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it. Now this is a commandment. to them at this point, right? Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. In other words, go and gather this manna, gather it's going to say here. And the children of Israel did so and gathered some more, some less. They could eat whatever their appetite was. They could gather it and eat it to the full. Verse 18, and when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over. He that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. And Moses said, let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. Now, this is very important, okay? This is a very important part of this lesson. Why did God cause there to be worms? Why did he cause this manna to spoil the next day? Because he said he told them that I didn't want you to save anything up, only eat that which you need today. Leave, don't keep any extra. Why would he do that? We know it's wise, like Joseph, he stored up grain in Egypt. We know it's wise to store up food and all that. But why did he do that here? Okay? Why did he do that here? Obviously, they couldn't store up food here anyways. They're traveling in the wilderness. It'd be really hard to carry a whole storehouse with you. And plus, you didn't grow anything, right? There's nothing out there. They're not even growing anything. God's feeding them. But why wouldn't he let them keep it for the next day? Because he was testing them to see if they had faith to believe that he was actually going to cause it to rain manna the next day. So the unbelievers would say, I don't know if God's really going to provide food tomorrow. I mean, this was my kind of a freak thing that happened. We got lucky. We got manna today, but it probably isn't going to be there tomorrow. Okay? So he was testing their faith. Okay? He was testing their faith. And we're going to see here in the Old Testament, the Sabbath was a test of faith. Do I need to work 6 days to feed my family, to accomplish this task or to accomplish that? Or can I afford to take a seventh day off? Do I have faith to believe that God will provide if I'm not working that seventh day? Because a lot of people will say, well, and this has happened in history, you study history, people arguing about the Sabbath, even in America. We'll get into it in our later studies, but the argument by some, wise, industrious person or some fool who thinks he's wise, he says, we're not going to observe the Sabbath. Are you kidding me? That's going to cut our production down 1/7. We're going to lose 1/7 of our productivity. That's too much. We can't afford that, right? Losing 1 day out of 7 where people lay around and do nothing. We need to work, work, work. Isn't that what Egypt was? There was no Sabbath in Egypt, guys. It was nonstop work. Here, God's going to try to teach them how and give them the gift of Sabbath, which is a... think about this. Who is free? Who is free? The person who can rest and not work 1 day out of 7 and just thank God for all the blessings, or the person that says, I got to get something done. I mean, I got to keep rolling. I can't afford to take a 7th day off. One's a slave and the other one's free. The other one, the free man, is the one who trusts in God and knows that God will provide on a day, and he doesn't have to do anything. In fact, this actually even teaches the spiritual principle that your own works cannot get you into heaven. Your own works can lead you to hell if you're unfaithful. But you cannot work your way into heaven, and the Sabbath day teaches that principle, because you work 6, and then you have to trust that God will make up the rest for you on the 7th, okay? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, okay, and some of them didn't believe. They thought, no, there's no way. It might not come. I better store some in my pockets here. And all of a sudden, they looked and it's worms. Think about when we disobey God, it doesn't matter how hard we work, how much we save. You will have worms eating and rotting away your wealth that you've gathered. Verse 21. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. When the sun waxed hot, it melted. Verse 22. And it came to pass that on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath of the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe that which you will seethe. Seethe is boil, bake and boil. And that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. So he says, if you're anything that you're going to cook it today on the 6th day. You get to gather twice. This is preparation day. This day is carried forth all the way into the New Testament. That's what they call it, preparation day. They're preparing for the day of rest. So they're pre-cooking all their food, and they are keeping also some fresh food, some fresh manna. And what do we know about the manna on the other 6 days? What would it do if you kept it over fresh? It would spoil, right? The worms would come. Will it do that on the 7th day? Let's see. And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. Now, what is God trying to show them? I can bless all the work you do on the 6 days, and you don't need to work on the 7th day. I will actually make sure, this is a supernatural thing, this is a supernatural blessing. I will make sure that the worms don't eat they don't eat the manna that you store up on the 6th day. Amazing. How many people today have that feeling that they have to work 7 days a week all the time, or else they're going to fall behind, are always doing that? They're always behind. They always have to work because the worms are eating everything that they're working for on every single day, because they don't have that faith to trust that they can rest in God. Verse 25. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today now check this out. I would highlight this in your Bible. Today, what day? The 7th day, after the 6 days of work. You shall not find it in the field. The manna didn't even come on the 7th day. So they could go out there, but it's not going to be there. So there's no blessing in working on the 7th day, because it's not there, right? 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. So does the principle work? The man that says, I'm losing 1/7 of productivity. Are you losing any productivity when you work 6 and rest 1? No, because God will see to it that you lose that productivity and more that you try to do on the 7th day. So that mathematically doesn't work out. Why doesn't? So the logical person would say, well, why doesn't it make sense to somebody who considers himself super logical, super intelligent, and all they can do is compute numbers? Because they don't believe in the supernatural. They don't believe in God. They have no faith. To a faithful person, this makes absolute sense, because we know God's at work. To the unbeliever, why would you allow people to take a day of rest for you? Let's say if you were somebody who owned a big business, or you had a bunch of slaves, if you didn't believe in God and you didn't fear Him, why would you allow your servants to take a day of rest? Because you'd be diminishing your riches. That's their mentality. Verse 28, and the Lord said unto Moses, check this out now, how long refuse you to keep my Sabbath only? What was the Sabbath? It was a test. This is why I said, if you don't, in the Old Testament anyways, if you didn't keep the Sabbath, it was a sign that you weren't going to fulfill any of God's commandments. Even in the New Testament, it says, if you are a violator of one of the commandments, you're a violator of all. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long? Now think about this. Does God say this to us in our lives today? How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? Trying to get to the next verse here. Here, I thought I had that all figured out. I'm going to have to do some more tests. Verse 29, see, for that the Lord hath given you, check this out, the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. It's a gift. The Sabbath is a gift. But yet the greedy person back here in the Old Testament would consider it a restriction. It's a restriction. I don't get to work. I don't get to gather riches for myself. I don't get to gather food. I'm worried that I won't be able to eat the next day. See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore he giveth, not burdens you with, giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. He gives you a double blessing on the 6th day. It's very interesting even. Let's just eliminate the supernatural part that God can do this. Studies have shown that when people go on vacation, they produce about, I don't know what the exact number is, but their production level is way higher than it would be on a normal day because they're moving at a faster pace. They're getting prepared. I'm going on vacation. I got to make sure this place can run without me for a week. So they're moving. But on a normal day, it might be a little bit less. They might be a little less diligent, right? You work harder when you know you have a deadline to meet. And I think this is fascinating because I think about the Sabbath as the end, like end of day 6 for the Israel, for the people in the Old Testament. It was like reaching the finish line. It's like you're running, you're getting all your work done, you're preparing. Day 6 is the day of preparation because you're not supposed to do, real intense cooking and preparing the next day. You're supposed to have it all pretty much ready so you could just enjoy the rest, right? So they're sprinting to that finish line and it's like a sense of accomplishment. Oh, we got there. Instead of, well, it's the 6th day. I don't really feel like doing that task today. I'll just do it tomorrow. And then what happens is now your productivity is less because there's always tomorrow to do it. If you know you can't do it tomorrow, now you're going to hurry up and work a little faster to get it done. So that's just eliminating the supernatural part of it. That's just speaking from an earthly perspective is you will be productive if you know you can't work the next day. But if I can do that tomorrow, I can just stretch out my schedule a little bit, get distracted here and there, and every day is the same. Every day is something I can work on that. All right. So God gave them double on the 6th day. Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. All right. Verse 30. So the people rested on the 7th day. And the house of Israel called the name thereof manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So it was like some kind of a seed that they could knead and make into bread and actually bake it. Okay. Many people who grind their own flour and everything, that, how this process works. So this would have been, they had to gather, basically it's like gathering grain that God rained from heaven. It wasn't loaves of bread that fell out of the sky and the children of Israel just be like, oh, thanks for that loaf of bread. They still had to work. It was those 6 days it took work to gather this and then to bake it and all that. All right. Now we're going to go to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, I always remember, if I ever forget where the 10 commandments are, I just go 10 times 2, the book of Exodus. Okay? The 10 commandments times 2 will get me to chapter 20 in the book of Exodus, and that's where the 10 commandments are. All right? So we're just going to skip on down. God's covered the first 3 commandments. And we're going to get into the 4th commandment here, verse 8. Remember, interesting it says remember. Why would he say remember? Because a lot of people would tend to forget it, Okay? It's the only commandment where God said, remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What does that mean? Well, if you treat something holy, do you treat it like everything else? Okay? There was, in the temple, there were holy vessels. There were vessels that were made out of gold and stuff they were only meant for certain service. You weren't just to casually use these vessels for your everyday use. Okay? So holy means set aside as special, pure, clean. Keep it holy. Well, how do we do that? So it's not just a rest. Now think about this. It's not just a rest. Because people will quote the verse where Jesus says, because the scribes and Pharisees were making it a burden, they'll say, hey, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath day is a day that I can pursue every desire of my heart. As long as I don't go punch the clock in at my employer, I can do whatever I want and not even think about God. Right? But that's holy. So our activities on their activities on the Sabbath they were supposed to keep it holy. Okay, keep it holy. Okay. Boy, it sounds like worse than it was before. Verse 9, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. 6 days. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. Remember, from creation. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. So we're trying to discover what was the Sabbath in the Old Testament. We're not trying to make any conclusions of what we should do today. We're going step one. It was a day where nobody, we find out here, where nobody was allowed to do normal work. Now, some would say, well, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but let's say you're trying to apply it today in this modern era. And let's say you're somebody who believes it should be applied. Well, you could say, well, I Sabbath on this day, or we can all just kind of pick a day to take a day of rest. But the original Sabbath was not a personal thing. It was a national thing, okay? Because God didn't just say, thou shalt rest. He said, thou, thy son, nor your daughter, your slaves, your slaves that were males, your slaves that were females, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that was within thy gates. Even the stranger think about this, even your animals were to rest on that day. Okay? Now, I'm going to jump ahead of myself a little bit because this is interesting. You know, cattle were used for plowing fields and stuff like that. They were used to work. Asses were meant to carry burdens, right? You carry goods and stuff. If the Sabbath no longer applies today as a literal day, how do we determine when the animals get rest? Okay? How do we determine when the animals get rest? You take a rest on that day. Let's say you take a rest on that day, but somebody else is working your animals. What about the animals? Okay? What if you're a business owner? What if you're a business owner and you keep your place open 7 days a week, but you take a Sabbath, you take a day off? Well, this commandment think about the wisdom of this commandment. It protected the employees, if you would, the people that worked for you, because the owner was mandated by God. You can't make those people work on that day. Everybody gets a day off. If this commandment wasn't there, you could have what we have today, as employers could force their employees to work 7 days a week and then say, if you don't do it, you're fired. I'll take somebody else. Okay? But if it was a law that applied to everybody, nobody would be in that conundrum. Okay, so the point is, it was not just a day of rest for individuals. It was a corporate thing. It was a national thing. Verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord, now check this out, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay, it's a blessed day. Now, what did the Pharisees make it out to be? A day of burden, right? Well, let's just skip the Pharisees. Let's take somebody back in the Old Testament. How would the greedy person look at this day? How would the selfish person look at this day? I'm not going to give God that day. That's a day for me. I get to do what I want to do. Okay? So it's a burden to the Pharisees made the day a burden because they added extra restrictions. Okay? But the infidel sees the Sabbath as a burden because they want to do what they want to do. And they don't want to feel obligated to obey God. So there's a flip side of the coin, and you don't want to pick one. You don't want to jump from one extreme to the other. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I skipped over. Okay, so now we leave that was the 4th commandment. Okay, the Sabbath day was a commandment. It wasn't one of the other minor laws, statutes, or ordinances that fell under that Jesus said hung under the 10 commandments, okay, or hung under the 2 great commandments. It was a commandment. It was the 4th commandment. And I will point this out too. It was a commandment unto God. The first 5 commandments, some people argue whether it's 4 or whether it's 5. The first 5 commandments were to God, and actually all 5 of them had the death penalty for violations. Don't worship any other gods. Don't have any idols. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Keep holy the Sabbath. And the other one's going to be, number 5 is going to be honor your mother and father. And some say, well, I didn't know yeah, there was a death penalty for that. If there was, back in the Old Testament law, if you had a disobedient or rebellious son or daughter, you would bring them in front of the whole community, in front of the elders, and say, this my son is a drunkard and rebellious and will not obey. And the whole community would stone him with stones till he died. Okay? So the first 5 commandments carried the death penalty. And so they were very serious. They were unto God. And the next 5 were commandments of how to love your neighbor. How to love your neighbor. All right. Exodus chapter 31, verse 12. And it says this, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, there we go. Oh, there we go. Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, verily my Sabbath shall you keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. Okay. Now, the Sabbath was a sign, and it might get into it a little bit here. I can't remember, but I want to make this point so I don't forget it. The Sabbath was a sign that you were a free man, free from the world, but a servant to God. Okay. Sabbath was a sign of freedom, the sign of freedom that we have in God. Okay. In other words, when other nations would look at Israel, Joshua, there we go. When other nations would look at Israel observing the Sabbath, they would see a nation that would be a sign to the world that they worshiped God. Now think about this. Today, when you cease from your own works and put your trust in God, what are you saying to the world? What are you saying to yourself? What are you saying to your family? You're telling them that you worship God by ceasing from your own works and trusting in His works, okay? And you're also declaring to the world, you don't own me, okay? Now, the person that was leaving Egypt here, or all the Israelites that obeyed the Sabbath, they in one sense, they were telling the Egyptians, telling Satan, you're not my master. Okay? God is my master. That's who I serve. So that's how it's a sign. Okay? A sign isn't, a sign is an important thing. It lets other people know who you are. Verily my Sabbath shall you keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you, or make you clean. Verse 14, you shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy unto you. Every one that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. So if God actually required the death penalty for it in the Old Testament, it's not a lighter commandment than the other 3 or the other 9. Today, it seems as though we look at that commandment as, to keep a day holy. Well, it's not murdering, it's not stealing, it's not dishonoring your parents. But in the Old Testament, at least, was it looked upon as equal and valid as all the other laws? It definitely was. It was the test for Israel in the wilderness. Obeying the Sabbath was a test, God said, that I was going to give them to see if they will walk in my laws or no. All right, verse 15. 6 days may work be done, but in the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. So again, it is. Now you could sit on your couch today and watch all kinds of professional sports and eat pizza and Doritos and chips and pop and whatever else. Are you finding true rest? What is rest? Okay, what is rest? We're going to find out next week. We're going to read some stuff in the prophets that really, are really cool. They talk about how wonderful the Sabbath is. In other words, physical rest, the Sabbath wasn't only about physical rest, because you will not find physical rest in overindulgence of self again on just another day. So if I said, well, the Sabbath is just a rest day, I don't have to keep it holy. What am I doing? I'm working for myself the 6 days. I'm doing whatever I want to do, right? I'm working to gather riches, wealth, food, or whatever. And then on the 7th day, I stop doing that, but I still just fill other of my own personal desires. So watching football on Sunday or any other professional sport, I mentioned football because it's taken over what has traditionally been the Christian Sabbath, which is Sunday. We'll get into those topics another time. So the Sabbath has turned from many people into, any people, you know what they call it today? Sunday fun day, okay? Sabbath has turned into a day of gluttony, a day of rest maybe from your regular work, but not rest for your soul. The Sabbath is a day of rest for your soul. That's the point, guys. Some say, well, it's not very restful to go to church on Sunday. Is the Sabbath day just a physical rest? Or is it a deeper rest? Okay. Matter of fact, the priests even, we're going to find out in Jesus talks about it. The priests even profaned the Sabbath because they worked on the Sabbath. They didn't profane it in a bad way. They broke the Sabbath because they worked. But they still had rest, spiritual rest, because they were in the Lord on that day. All right. They weren't farming on that day. They were, teaching the word of God, taking care of the sacrifices of the temple and all that. All right. Okay, verse 16. 16. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. All right. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. Now check this out. It's for some people that say the Sabbath was only given to Israel. It was a temporary thing. Now again, I'm not going into the future today, what it should be, but it definitely went back to man. It definitely went back to Adam, because he says it right here. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Okay? Now, when you think about the commandments and you start thinking about whether they apply today or not, I like to think, well, if God took the time to write it with his own finger in stone, not just on paperwork, stone, everlasting, okay? And stone was it would last. I mean, you go and I actually saw down in New Mexico. I'm trying to think of it. It was a mountain they called Mystery Mountain, where there are the 10 Commandments that were inscribed upon this big, huge natural slab that was made, on the side of a mountain, a little mountain, and it was in ancient Paleo Hebrew, the 10 Commandments, and they say that was done so many hundred years before Christ, okay? And it's still there. It's in stone, right? So paper, we know from manuscripts that paper will go bad and then somebody has to recopy them. But stone is everlasting. So just thinking about, okay, does this commandment apply today? Well, nobody would argue that the other 9 are still in force today. Nobody would say it's okay to worship other gods. It's okay to make idols and bow down to them. It's okay to use the Lord's name in vain now because Jesus came. It's okay to dishonor your parents because if you honor Christ in your heart, who cares about your parents? I'm being a little bit flippant here, but the point is, nobody says that about the other commandments. Nobody says, hey, I'm saved by the blood of Jesus. I can go murder my neighbor if he pisses me off, okay? That just doesn't happen. But for some reason with the commandment where God says, remember it, people say, no, it's not around anymore, okay? It's not around anymore. All right. Written with the finger of God. I think I have one more place to go to for this first part. Okay, so Exodus 35, verse 1. Exodus 35, verse 1. And Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together, and he said unto them, these are the words which the Lord hath commanded that you should do them. Okay, notice commandments are not suggestions. They're not principles. They're not, this is a good thing to do if you really want to. It'll be great for you. A commandment is God saying you shall do this or you shall not. It's not like I said, it's not the 10 suggestions for healthy living. Verse 2, 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day there shall be to you an holy day. Okay? A Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. Now, I brought up football earlier, and it was funny. There was this, I was doing some studying on the Bible and sports. And a lot of sports people, and some of them are sincere, right? They'll give credit to God all the time, right? But some will use that as an excuse to maybe just look the part of a Christian. Hey, all glory goes to God. And it can become kind of just something they say. One guy was recorded as saying, hey, all glory be to God. All those people in this town, they're going to know my name next time. They're going to know my name. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was really funny because he says all glory goes to God, but then he's talking about how the other team's going to know how good they are and they're going to know his name. Like, they better fear me because I'm coming into town. Okay. All right. I mention that because, keeping the day holy, somebody could say, well, if I give God the glory for everything I do on that day, I can do anything I want, right? Some people have that view. I can do whatever I want as long as I'm giving God the glory. All right. Whosoever doeth any work shall be, okay. Let me see where we're at here. Okay, whoops. Got ahead. Now you know there's only one more verse. You shall kindle, verse 3, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Now some people are probably thinking, that's almost ridiculous. Why should you kindle no fire on the Sabbath day? Okay. Now remember, this wasn't a burden. God commanding this back here was not a burden that the Pharisees were laying on people. This was an actual legitimate thing. Now, back in these times, now what I can glean from this, and maybe I have more to learn on this, I ask myself, why would God make this command? Okay, why would you kindle no fire? Today, you can just, it doesn't take much work just to start a fire. I can just put some lighter fluid on some sticks and just throw it and it's there, right? It's not a lot of work. Well, back then, starting a fire, kindling a fire, you didn't have matches and lighters. I mean, it was a lot of work to start a fire. In fact, anybody watch those survival shows on how they got special sticks where they got to rub, and they said they had to rub those sticks a long time, right? And then you got to start that fire out with just this little tiny fire to kindle it. You get it going with little, then you got to keep adding. It's a very labor intensive thing to kindle a fire. Okay. Now, I don't think there was, as far as I know, there weren't any prohibitions against starting the fire on the sixth day and just continually feeding it, okay? I would imagine if you needed warmth, God wasn't going to say, on the Sabbath day, you shall freeze to death, okay? So it's common sense. And also a lot of, you would use fire for a lot of cooking, and the cooking was supposed to be done on the sixth day anyway. So we're going to find out later next week, there's going to be a man that's going to gather a bunch of sticks on the Sabbath day, and it's not going to go too well for him. So that would be something. So how would that apply in the Old Testament? I would say if somebody, my view on this, my opinion, if there was a fire already going and all the wood was sitting 3 feet or whatever in a safe distance away from the fire, I'm guessing it wasn't against God's commandment to just grab a log and put it on there. But if you're out there scouring your woods all day for lumber to burn, that's pretty labor intensive. If anybody's ever, think about cutting wood. It's enough work with a chainsaw. Imagine cutting wood by hand and gathering sticks and all that. So fascinating. So the things that we learned about the Sabbath, it was from in the Old Testament thus far, it was from creation. It was made for man, but not necessarily just for man's, and we're going to find this out in the next week's study, not just for man to live out extra pleasures that he wouldn't have had time to do during the Sabbath day, but to find real joy in the Lord by making a day holy. It's almost like it was an appointment with God, right? The Israelites were commanded 1 day out of 7, hey, you work really hard, and then on that 7th day, you have an appointment to meet me. We're going to spend time together. And the Sabbath breakers in the Old Testament they were the kind of people that I don't want to spend time with God. That's too much for me. Okay. So it was from creation. It was a blessing. It was a commandment. It was a commandment. It was the 4th commandment. It was a sign. When the Israelites would observe it, it would be a sign that they were in covenant with God. And is there anything else I'm missing? That's sign of their faith. Yeah. Yep. It was a test also. The Sabbath was a test whether they would keep God's law or not. God didn't tempt them with profaning his name or anything like that. He was going to test them if they, it seems as though he figured if they were going to keep my Sabbath, they'd probably pass a test that they're going to keep my other laws. If they'll do this, they'll probably do this, right? So a lot of interesting, like I said, a lot of interesting things about what the Sabbath was. It seemed to be a wonderful way for the Israelites to make time for God, to get together, to let everybody rest, and to cease from the cares of this life. So we will be right back with questions and comments. Be sure to join us live every Thursday morning, 9:30 a.m. for prophecy updates, and Sunday mornings, 10:30 a.m. for our line-by-line Bible studies. If you live near Princeton, Minnesota, and would like to join us in person for our Sunday morning church services, please email me at ben@christianovercomers.com for details and directions. Also, be sure to visit our website at christianovercomers.com to sign up for our weekly email updates, find our latest prophecy updates on video or podcast, catch up with our line-by-line studies, also available on video or audio podcast. And we even archive all of our studies by date. So if you have a phone or a tablet, bookmark this page so you can play our studies on the go while you're driving, going for a run, or doing chores. Now to our questions and comments. All right, welcome back. We're going to take questions and comments. Do we have any?
Yeah, I have some. Well, and I don't want to step on what you might be saying in the next ones, and if I am, just we'll pass on it. But I feel like it was that, yeah, we need to keep the Sabbath and all the 10 Commandments still apply, but doesn't it seem like they are... But as far as pertaining to the Sabbath, that it's less legalistic now under the New Testament?
Yeah, that like because I mentioned.
For one thing, you're not killing people, so that right there says it's less legalistic.
Right.
But
well, I wouldn't say that would be legalistic to do that back in the Old Testament.
No, not then. But
yeah.
Well,
I would say legalistic would be you're. I don't even know if I like that word. I would say you're holding on to the traditions of men or man-made laws versus God's requirements. And the Pharisees, that's what they did.
The reason I say that is because there's that scripture where the Pharisees called out Jesus for, what was he, healing on the Sabbath?
Right. Yep.
Which would be working, I guess. And Jesus basically said, I don't have it in front of me, but in my paraphrasing that, you guys are a little too legalistic on this. Yeah, we do need to observe that, but I have an opportunity to help somebody here, so. Right.
Well, we're going to find out that during the Sabbath day, even in the Old Testament, as we move it into the prophets and forward, that it was lawful. Jesus says it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. It was never unlawful. But the Pharisees, they looked at Jesus. They looked at it as pure work. He's working, and that's what we want to avoid, right? But so, let's say if you were somebody who believed that the seventh day Sabbath was literal today, and you wanted to observe it, what can I do? Well, can you? If you knew somebody was sick, and there was nobody to help them, could you walk 50 miles to go help them? And the answer would be yes. Okay. If you knew that they needed help and there was nobody going to be able to help them, it's lawful to do well. And Jesus even said that it was lawful to pull an ox that had fallen into the ditch out on. It's lawful to do that on the Sabbath day. You wouldn't just leave if your neighbor's ox fell into the ditch, you wouldn't just say, "Sorry, buddy, it's a Sabbath," because that just violates the spirit of the law, right? And that's a lot of work to pull a big animal out of. They're going to work hard physically. And so that's why it wasn't really just a day of physical rest. It was a day of cessation from worldly aspirations and desires. And it was a day that you set aside as a spiritual day of rest, renewal, comfort, and all that. And so if you're helping somebody, that is actually what the Sabbath, in fact, that is what the Sabbath is. When you stop and you rest from your toils of the whole week, you're being healed. Your spirit, not only your flesh body is healing, but your spirit, your mind, your mental facilities, you're being healed because of that day. And so healing somebody on that day is actually fulfilling the Sabbath law because you're helping them recover.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit, but like there is some gray area because, like what you just said, that scripture said you can't start a fire on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Well, what if somebody's freezing? You know, back then,
Yeah. Well, I
and you
think,
went and you started a fire for them so they were warm and they didn't die from hypothermia.
well, if
Well,
you're
now
in
you're breaking the law literally, but
well, I would say no, because you wouldn't be violating the law if they were freezing. If they just wanted to, if they were lazy on the sixth day and they didn't cook any food and they're like, I'm going to cook now, then they're going to be okay if they missed a day of food because of their ill preparedness, right? Now, Jesus and the disciples, well, this goes back to David too. When David was running from Saul, he went into the temple on I think it was the Sabbath day actually, and ate it was Sabbath day, right? He ate the showbread that was there because he was starving, but he was doing God's work, right? He was God's anointed. And later on in the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles were walking through the fields on a mission to go help people, but they were plucking corn, which was lawful to do on any other day if you're walking by. You couldn't just harvest people's food, but you could eat enough to sustain you as you're traveling. And so the Pharisees came out and said, why do your disciples do that which is unlawful on the Sabbath day? Because they were eating corn. And Jesus mentioned that do you not know the story of David eating the showbread and so forth. So they were on a mission. The spirit of the law was they were on a mission to help people. Okay. Now, if I'm sitting on my couch watching professional sports all day, my spirit is not out there to help somebody, right? Or if I'm running around everywhere doing something, right? If my intention is your literal intention is not, well, maybe there'll be somebody to help along the way, but I'm going there to do this, then it was always lawful on the Sabbath day to do that. And so what we're going to find out when we get into those studies is that the scribes and the Pharisees weren't obeying the Sabbath according to the commandments of God. They were the do-gooders that would be watching people and, waiting for any little violation, say, oh, that's a violation of the Sabbath. Okay. The spirit of the Sabbath didn't matter to them. They were just setting themselves up as Israel's new oppressors, if you would. They were the new pharaohs in town, and they wanted to make sure they controlled everybody's lives. But it wasn't. That's the misconception that you often get is people will jump and will think any kind of, you hear the word Sabbath almost, and you think of the scribes and Pharisees. So you associate the word Sabbath with scribes and Pharisees, much like the world has now associated love with LGBTQ and rainbows. They don't equate each other. It's not an accurate equation. Jesus, literally, when you look at his life, he didn't break the Sabbath, the purpose of the Sabbath, even though he did some work as healing, but that was lawful. He literally did what every one of us should strive to do on the Sabbath day in observing it. He fulfilled the Sabbath better than any man probably that ever lived on the earth. So he never violated it, unless it was something where somebody perceived it as a violation because it was work, but it was not. It was good work.
That says with the Pharisees. I think it's somewhere in Matthew where he talks about the Passover, the weightier matters of the law. Like they strain at a gnat but swallow a camel.
Right.
And so it's like, all God's commandments and all God's law is important, but there's things that are more important, like, mercy, justice, love, faith. If you violate like those principles to try to keep maybe the lesser matters of the law, you're basically contradicting the law altogether, and so it's like just understanding like what you were saying about like showing somebody love about making a fire, somebody who's maybe poor and cold or something, that's the weightier matters of the law, the things that are more important, the mercy, justice, faith, and stuff. And so,
Well, I heard that. Now, here's an example of Phariseeism, right? I heard that in New York, there's the large Jewish community there. They have the elevators programmed to just continually go from floor to floor to floor to floor. So you're not violating the Sabbath if you're using the elevator, as long as you don't push the button and ignite a fire. So they have it set so that they don't have to push the button. They just the elevator just cycles and cycles, so they can use the elevator as long as they could just jump. If they don't want to go to the floor, it'll open every floor. So if you're on floor 1 and you need to get up to 10, you're going to get in the elevator, but you're not pushing the button. It'll stop at every floor. So you didn't kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. Now, that is the kind of ridiculousness that the Jews today have inherited by the Pharisees. And that's not what the Sabbath, what Jesus has said. That's where Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We're not supposed to be a slave on another day. We are. Here's the thing about the Sabbath too, and some would say, well, when we get to some other verses where it talks about how the Sabbath is not supposed to be a day where you're doing your own pleasures, but honoring God, that's a restriction. But when you look at it, it's really not, because we find true joy in the Lord. And the more time we spend with Him, that's where we're going to find the true rest. And it may seem like a restriction, like, oh man, this is the but think about it. All those other things you can do if you plan your days out wisely, you can do those other things on the other 6 days. If you take I got to say the word if, because we're going through this, we're not making any declarations right now. If you are one that believes the Sabbath is still very much in effect today.
Along with what you just said about the elevator, in St. Louis Park, it's a Jewish community, and they have a thing called, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Eruv. And I don't know who invented this, because I don't think it's in the Bible, so somebody had to come up with it. But it's an area that's been blessed, and it's within a boundary of the power lines. I guess I was just looking it up a second ago, and in other places it's like a string. You can make one with a string, but they've decided that the power lines that circle a certain part of the town, and if you're in this eruv, then you can do things like cook, and it's crazy, but that's what they really do. And I don't know if it allows them to do anything, or if it just allows them to, I don't know. That's where that whole legalism thing comes in. It's like that's just like, that's legalistic. You're being like, I can't touch a button. I can't turn a light switch on, or I can't do this or do that. But if I make this little boundary up and some rabbi blesses it, now I can do things. But yeah, that's a real thing.
Yeah, I would the term the legalistic. I would say some people look at that as, okay, I'm following the law. You're legalistic. You're really strictly obeying it. But strictly obeying it is good. It's when you are you're adding extra things to something, or you are finding loopholes in the law to justify certain things, but yet condemn other things and all that. It's
right.
just, I look at it as twisting and distorting the law.
Yeah.
But the term could be, I know that term's used a lot, and it depends who hears it, but some people could hear that and think legalistic is somebody who wants to obey the 10 Commandments.
Right.
Oh, you know what I mean? It's what Jesus said, if you love me, you keep my commandments. So we've just got to, that term is just, we've got to understand the term.
Yep. Philip says, I know this is off topic, but I'd like to hear your reaction to the bill the House passed a few days ago to combat anti-Semitism.
I have heard people talking a lot about that lately, but to be honest, I haven't paid close enough attention to that. I'll have to get caught up on that. Any of you guys have you guys been following that?
Not with any amount where I could speak to it.
Yeah. I'll have to pass on that one because I'm not quite informed on all the matters related to that.
But normally what it ends up being is it's like they're just doing stuff that the laws already apply to it. Like you can't
Well, they're creating
harm anyone. You can't. I don't care what they are, what race they are. But I mean, I guess I shouldn't even speak to it because does that mean you can't say bad things about them?
Yeah. Well, hate speech, hate crimes laws, all of that, whether it's you can't speak against LGBTQ. What it's doing is it's making protected classes of
Right.
non-Christians. And if you're a Christian and you say you're a sinner for doing that, now you've just violated that protected class. Or if you point out a certain group tends to this group tends to do this in our society or whatever, you can't say the truth even if it's the truth because now it's whatever. But you can say all the vile things you want against Christians and there's no special law
Right.
to protect us.
Right. Well, and it's obviously a violation of the First Amendment. You should be able to say anything, even if it's mean.
Right. Well, it's the same. I mean, it's like there are new blasphemy laws being put in place. That's what hate crimes laws really are. You can't blaspheme or degrade their belief in any way. But you can use the Lord's name in vain all you want. You can post. You can have artwork that depicts Jesus in a jar of urine and stuff like that, but that's not considered a hate crime. Yeah, imagine if you had a picture of something degrading them to that level.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. All right. Hey, I'm excited to get into this. I think these foundational studies in the Sabbath are good to lay the foundation, but I think the fun stuff is really yet to come. Some of the really interesting stuff concerning the Sabbath. And as we start to, because everybody wants to know, does it still apply today? So I think it's important that we do, as Proverbs says, we search out a matter before we answer it so that we can answer it with wisdom rather than any sort of rashness. So we look forward to seeing you guys next time. Until then, stay in His Word every single day so that you can be a Christian overcomer.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you, and thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of His terrible sword. His truth is marching on.